I said I wouldn't.
That you wouldn't embarrass me. Okay, I try to calm him down, but you know, he's a retired colonel and a pilot, and as mentioned before, you can always tell a pilot, but you can't tell him much. Many years ago, the phone rang and my husband answered it, and it was a gentleman from Chicago, from the Northwest Territory Association, and he wanted me to come up and talk about Francis Marion. Now, my husband gently reminded him that Francis Marion had never been in the Northwest Territories. And the gentleman said, yes, but Mel Gibson has, and we have seen The Patriot. And we have heard that it's based on the life of Francis Marion, and our event will be at the College of DuPage. We'll have a lot of teachers there because they will get credit for it, and our teachers want to know more about Francis Marion. So I went up. I wrote a paper called Francis Marion, Stranger Than Fiction, 18 pages, and every teacher got a copy. Now, you can relax because I'm not going to read you 18 pages. But what I wanted to address was an issue that bothers me, and I know it bothers many of you. Because of people like Mel Gibson and his movie, and Walt Disney, and Weems, and William Cullen Bryant, and James, they focus on Francis Marion in the swamp. So most of the world knows Francis Marion as the Swamp Fox, as a sort of revolutionary Rambo, or a swamp-dwelling Robin Hood. And we know that there's far more to Francis Marion than the few months he spent in the swamp. And so I wanted to correct that as much as I could. Now, although I went into great detail for the teachers about what had happened in the swamp, I'm just going to skip over that because all of you people know it. But Bass continued this emphasis on the Swamp Fox. In fact, that's what he named his book. And he wrote the most significant period in the career of Francis Marion was that between August the 15th, 1780 and September the 8th, 1871. Now, really? I don't think so. But he also continued he was moody, introverted, semi-literate genius. And I think when you read David Neelan's work, you'll find out that he was certainly not just semi-literate. Now, Marion was probably born in Berkeley County in 1732. He is described as not larger than a New England lobster and might easily enough have been put in a quart pot. He was born with malformed knees and ankles, and to me that sounds like a very premature child. When he was grown, he would be shorter than an average man of his time with his legs poorly formed. In other words, he was a runt. Now, when he was 6, the family moved back to the Wynyard Bay area, where a lot of the Marion family and extended family lived. And it is said, as David mentioned yesterday, that he went to sea as a teenager and aboard a schooner that sank. Now, David yesterday raised some doubt about that event. But I have, and I didn't bring it because I didn't know David was going to raise the issue, an article from the Georgetown paper of the period with a picture of a multi-masted schooner that was a trading ship that had been hit and sunk by a sperm whale. And the crew and the captain that survived had been returned to Georgetown. Now, whether Marion was on that ship or not is a matter of conjecture, but it could be possible. Now, the father of the family died when Francis was about 18, and the youngest unmarried child, he took over the care of his mother and the family property, and was probably a pretty decent planter. Now, his first military experience was in 1756, when the Cherokees threatened the backcountry. And he joined the South Carolina troops, which were then under British control, and his company commander was William Moultrie. Now, you've heard the story about him cleaning out the pass that the Indians were prepared an ambush. Now, if you go to Spruce Pine in North Carolina, at the Mineral Museum, on the grounds there's a huge boulder, and in it a steel plaque commemorating Francis Marion clearing out that pass. Now, that's the Gillespie Pass, and as Joe will tell you, that was a very important one in the road to Kings Mountain. But that was not the pass that this army took to get to the lower towns of the Cherokee. So it's in the wrong place, but I would rather have him honored in the wrong place than not honored at all, so I'm not going to tell North Carolina they made a mistake. Now, he returned to life as a planter, and he did fare quite well, but by 1770, he had moved to the Santee Pond Bluff, just north of his brother's plantation, Belle Isle, and close to Nelson's Ferry. Now, he became very successful as a planter of indigo, and by the time of the Revolutionary War, he had 20 slaves. In 1775, in April, you had the hostilities at Lexington and Concord. Took about a month for the word to get down here, and when Francis learned that, he went to Charleston and enlisted. And of course, the commander was his old company commander, now Colonel Moultrie. And he was commissioned as a captain in the 2nd Regiment. Now, his first assignment was to recruit along the Santee and the Pee rivers. And when he had collected about 60, he took them to Charleston to train them. Now, when Fort Moultrie was attacked, Marion commanded the artillery. Now, he is credited with firing the last shot that took out the flagship, the Bristol. Whether that's true or not, he was there. He did command the artillery, and it was his sergeant, Sergeant Jasper, who became a hero at that point. Now, after the British came south and they took Savannah in 29th of December, 1778. By that time, Marion was a major. When the Congress took the Southern troops into the Continental Army. From that point on, Francis Marion held a commission in George Washington's Continental Army and did until the end of the war. He was a professional soldier. And at the siege of Savannah, when the French and the Americans tried to take it back, Marion was conspicuous with his bravery. I believe he commanded the charge against Spring Hill Redoubt, recaptured the flag, but unfortunately he lost Sergeant Jasper. Now, that failed, and they returned to South Carolina, to Charleston. And by now, Marion is a lieutenant colonel commanding the 2nd South. And he was a very, very rough commander of his troops. And he demanded that they be clean-shaven, that they be clean, that they build their latrine a good distance away from the billets, and that they not display uncouth behavior or their naked bodies to the sensitive ladies of Charleston. And if they did, he had them lashed, which was the common punishment at the time. One of his lieutenants characterized him as an ugly, cross, knock-kneed, hook-nosed son of a bitch. And his troops referred to him, probably not affectionately, as the hook-nosed bastard. Now, in Charleston, social life went on, and in the 19th of March at a party, it was hosted by Alexander McQueen at Trad Street, and the host invited choice Whigs. Now, as the commander and a lieutenant colonel commanding the troop, Marion was obliged to attend. Now, the host felt that a successful party, everybody had to get roaring drunk, so he locked the door. And Marion is described as abstemious. Now, I don't know a Frenchman who doesn't enjoy wine and good liquor, but evidently he was not much of a drinker, and he certainly wasn't very sociable. And wishing to leave, as Weems said, escape a debauch, he jumped out of the window and, as Rankin reports, broke his ankle in a shocking manner. Now, April the 12th, Rutledge was being moved out of, the governor was being moved out of Charleston, and Major Lincoln ordered all supernumerary officers to be withdrawn. And Marion was carried by a litter out of Charleston and was hidden in his home area along the Santee River. So he missed being taken to Charleston, and he missed Tarleton moving up through, and he eventually heard that Cornwallis was now in Camden and Continentals were moving to the south. So he went up to report to the commander, at that time, Baron de Kalb, and Baron de Kalb sent him back to South Carolina to collect information. Now, when Gates was assigned to the Continental Army, Marion went up to report to him. It makes sense. Lieutenant Colonel with the Continental Commission reporting to the new commander. And his reception was not cordial. Otto Williams describes the encounter as, Colonel Marion, a gentleman from South Carolina, has been with the Army a few days, attended by very few followers, distinguished by small leather caps and the wretchedness of their attire. Their number did not exceed 20 men and boys, some white, some black, all mounted, most of them miserably equipped. Their appearance was in fact so burlesque that it was with much difficulty the diversion of the regular soldiery was restrained by the officers, and the general himself was glad of an opportunity of detaching Colonel Marion, at his own instance, toward the interior of South Carolina, with orders to watch the motion of the enemy. Now, Gates didn't know what to do with this ugly little runt who happened to be a lieutenant colonel in the Continental Army. And when Williamsburg District asked for him to be, Marion to be their commander, Gates agreed. It was his way of getting rid of Marion. But that's really not typical to assign a career military officer to command a militia brigade. But he did. Now, when Marion met his Williamsburg militia at Witherspoon's Ferry, Gates was being trounced at Camden. And so, again, Francis Marion, through luck or providence, escaped capture. And Marion went into the swamp. First ordered his men to wear white cockade. Now, yesterday we heard about the fortification at Nelson's Ferry. The British had to move all of their equipment from Charleston to Camden. And not only equipment, but men, munitions, powder, medical supplies, rum, and all the accoutrements of the army. And Marion controlled the area from there, from Nelson's Ferry to Camden. And Cornwallis never again was completely in control of his supply line. And the British in Camden sent 5 commanders into the swamp to stop Marion. Now, I'll just mention them in passing because you know them all. First, the Great Savannah, he attacked British soldiers who were guarding prisoners and routed them, and every man riding with Marion got a couple of English muskets, bayonets, ammunition, cartouche boxes, and then they retreated to Burton's Neck. Now, General Gates was looking for some promising news, and so he sent this to Congress. And Congress published this probably in what was the forerunner of the Congressional Record. It mentioned Marion, but they misspelled his name. Now, he was in camp for a short time, and then he attacked Tories at Blue Savannah and ambushed them and inflicted serious casualties. Lord Cornwallis could not ignore it, and so he sent out the first of the commanders, and that would be Weymouth. And Weymouth, with his scorched earth policy, laid waste from the Santee River to Georgetown, an area 70 miles long and 20 miles wide. Burned homes, hanged farmers, and destroyed everything, including Presbyterian churches, which he thought were workshops of sedition. And Marion left because he didn't have the manpower to stop him, and hid in the swamps of North Carolina. Now, after Weems had left, a young boy, William Dobin James, 15 years old, went into the swamp to find Marion and his father, Major James. And he wrote the description of Marion that is widely used in almost every textbook. And later, he rode with Marion as part of the brigade, starting as a 15-year-old. Now, long after Marion was dead, William Dobin James, who by now was a judge, wanted to be sure that people remembered Marion. And a lot of men were still alive that knew Marion and had ridden with him. And so James collected a good bit of information and wrote the book on the Marion Brigade. Now, he was a very learned man, but his book probably suffers from his old age and what I am told is alcoholism. But you must remember that Horry was an officer in landed gentry, and William Dobin James is a private in the militia and the son of an ordinary farmer. So you get a little different slant there. But he obviously was a great admirer of Marion. Now, when Marion came back, he was able to muster a lot of men because people now knew they could not live with the British presence. And he immediately attacked Colonel Ball at Black Mingo, took Ball's horse, the sorrel gelding, and rode that for the rest of the campaign. He called that horse Ball, which would suggest that Francis Marion might have had a sense of humor. And now, according to James, public worship and public education had been discontinued. From now, most males from teens to old age were engaged in active and bloody warfare. Now, after Ball's attack, Cornwallis was still concerned about Marion, and he had moved to Charlotte, and he ordered Weems back to the PD. But Kings Mountain happened, and Cornwallis had to retreat, and he needed Weems, so Weems was recalled. Now, in Camden, the commander enlisted about 80 men from the high hills of the Santee under the command of Tyne, and they went down the old river road to neutralize Marion. And at Tarcoit Swamp, which is here in Clarendon County, Marion routed them and captured 80 horses, 80 sails, the whole thing. And again, that upset the British considerably. Now, finally, they sent Tarleton back from the Winnsboro area. And you know that Marion led to Tarleton in a chase of 35 miles through what is mostly Clarendon County. The head of Jack's Creek, around the Catalico River, back to Venmo's Ferry, where he had prepared an ambush. But Tarleton didn't get that far. He called off his troops, and he is reported to have said, according to James, "Come, my boys, let us go back, and we will find the gamecock, but for this damned old fox, the devil himself could not catch him." Now, when James wrote this, it was long after Marion was dead, and I think there's still some question about whether Marion was ever called the swamp fox during his lifetime. But along the river road from Nelson's Ferry to Camden, Marion owned the road. And another officer, not sent up from Camden, but moving troops up from Charleston, decided that he would try going through, and his sheer numbers would protect him. His name was McElrath, and Marion attacked him at Halfway Swamp and discontinued the attack at Singleton's Ferry, or Singleton's Mill, because the Singleton family had malaria. Now, Marion's men were not afraid of much, but they were afraid of malaria, and so they broke out the engagement. Now, late in the year, and early in January, more troops arrived in Charleston, and it was decided they needed something to clear the road between Nelson's Ferry and Camden. And the assignment was given to Colonel John Tadwell Watson. And he built a fort on top of an Indian mound at Scott's Lake. And being a humble man, he named it after himself, and so we have Fort Watson. But it was a great place for the British to assemble, but it didn't bother Marion much because he didn't need that road anyway. Now, Marion had stopped the traffic, literally, on the north side of the Santee River. But he was forced to keep a very low profile because he had very little ammunition. Gates had none to give him. And finally, when Nathaniel Greene took over command, he moved the Continental headquarters to Hicks Creek, which is up by Cheraw on the PD River, north of where Marion was encamped at that time at Goddard's Plantation or Snow's Island. Now, at the first of the year, Marion had been promoted to Brigadier General of the militia. And Greene had sent Light Horse Harry Lee down to campaign with him. Now, that is the odd couple of the Revolution. Lee, Virginia royalty, and Francis Marion, withdrawn, probably asocial, moody, suspicious to the point of paranoia, little runt. and they got along famously, and they attacked Georgetown. Now, we know from both James and Weems that Francis Marion cared about the safety of his men. Now, and of course, we would expect them to believe that. But Lee makes the same observation, because when they attacked Georgetown, the British maintained a redoubt. All the rest of the British left in the ships to wait out the attack. And Lee writes that they could have taken that redoubt, but that Captain Postel would have had to make a frontal attack, and Francis Marion would not risk the casualties. So you have from an outside source, another Continental officer, that Marion was very protective of the men that he served. Now we have Cowpens, Greene leaves the area, Lee leaves the area, and Marion's by himself, and Rawdon decides that he is going to take care of Marion once and for all, and he sends Watson with 500 men across from the Santee River area, and Doyle from Camden with 500 more to catch Marion in a pincer attack. Now, I'm not sure that Marion ever knew where Doyle was, but he knew where Watson was, and he met him at White Swamp and fought in what we call the Bridges campaign that that moved from the Santee River to Georgetown. And Marion contesting every river crossing, every bridge, every swamp. And when Watson finally, after 3 weeks, made his way to Georgetown, he finally came with 2 wagon loads of wounded, and he left 20 dead on the field at Sandfoot River, and a multitude of casualties across the way. Now, Marion then went to Snow's Island and found that Doyle had attacked while he was gone, and then he chased Doyle. And they had a few confrontations before Doyle made it back to Camden. Now, Marion was despondent because his militia all went home. Now, it's spring. They'd been in the field much longer than they were required to, and it was planting time, and the families needed them, and they went home. Now, Marion, of course, when he had commanded regular troops, had complete control over them, and he was disgusted by now with militia, and he spoke of going to Philadelphia. And I suppose that he hoped that Congress would give him an assignment with the Continental Army. But then he learned that Light Horse Harry Lee was returning. And when Lee came back, he had no ammunition, but he told of Greene's campaign to take back the South. From that point on, Francis Marion is once again a Continental officer commanding militia, but dedicated to Greene's campaign. For the most part, he wasn't always cooperative, but usually he was. And they moved against Fort Watson and started a siege. Now Marion is involved in conventional warfare. And you know they took Fort Watson, moved to Fort Mott, and started a siege. Again, not a hit-and-run guerrilla operation, but conventional warfare. And after Fort Mott fell, Greene comes down and meets Marion for the first time. And wouldn't you like to be a fly on the wall for that meeting? Now, it is said that Greene reminded Marion that he, Greene, had not taken a day's leave since the war started. Of course, by now he had fathered 4 children, so he wasn't always in the field. But Francis Marion was evidently comforted by the attention, and there was no more talk of going to Philadelphia, and he moved back across the Santee River, intending to intimidate the